What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back for another one of my top 10 videos, and today the saucy topic at hand is the top 10 erotic thrillers from the 1990s. If you're not aware, the Criterion Channel has been running this thing for a couple weeks where they've been celebrating a lot of the great erotic thrillers from the 1980s and from the 1990s. And even though I've been watching erotic thrillers my entire life, I saw a few of the essentials for the very first time. And for my money, I just never get tired of this topic. If you follow my podcast, Wrong Reel, you'll be familiar with my Naughty 90s Nostalgia series that I've been doing with Bill Scurry on episodes 491, 550, 587, and 628. If you're interested, go over to wrongreel.com and check those out. But I guess one of the main reasons that I wanted to celebrate these movies today is I feel like the erotic thriller of the 80s and 90s was kind of like the spiritual and stylistic successor to the classic film noir of the 40s and 50s. It basically has all the same ingredients, but with the added bonus of seeing the stars get it on. I feel like in a lot of ways, the erotic thriller represents the equivalent of like the red light district, but for cinema. And for young movie fans who grew up during the 21st century, it might shock and amaze you to hear this, but once upon a time, erotic thrillers were big business. The budgets were relatively low in these movies, apart from the above-the-line costs like the movie stars and the directors involved. But every once in a while, one of these movies like Fatal Attraction or Basic Instinct will come along and would generate massive amounts of money. And just to give you an idea of some of the directors who dabbled in the genre in the 90s, we've got David Lynch, Sidney Lumet, William Friedkin, Paul Verhoeven, Stanley Kubrick, David Cronenberg. Not bad company for any filmmaker out there. But for me, there are two big debates surrounding these kinds of movies. First, which decade was better, the 80s or the 90s? And the second debate is, why did these movies go away? Let's tackle the first debate first. I lean toward the 90s because the summer of 1990, I turned 14, and the summer of 1999, I turned 23. These were my hormonal years. These were my horny years. And naturally, all these movies are going to have a disproportionate impact on my fertile, impressionable brain. But as far as the second question goes, why did these movies go away? I have two theories. First and foremost, in the early 2000s, suddenly big budget PG-13 branded content took over. Whether you're talking about the Harry Potter franchise or the Lord of the Rings films or the revolution of the superhero films, whatever the case might be. But suddenly, like $200 million movies with a PG-13 rating became big business. And for the last 20 years, Hollywood's gone all in on that front and never looked back. But I also think the arrival of the internet played a huge role because suddenly you didn't need to go see Basic Instinct in the theater to get your rocks off. You could just log on to your favorite kinky site online and see all kinds of crazy shit. So I feel like online porn definitely drained the erotic thriller of a lot of its audience. And these days, every once in a while, a show or a movie will come along that is reminiscent of this period. A show like Jet, starring Carla Gugino. I feel like it's an excellent example. Came out on Cinemax like 2 years ago. But anyway, fantastic show with abundant nudity. But as far as this top 10 list goes, I must confess it is incomplete. For every fresh discovery that I make or for every classic that I revisit, I seem to come across like 5 more movies that I want to watch. But if I keep doing research, I'm never going to make the video, so let's just call this video a work in progress. I mean, I've been doing research on this topic for decades, but I'm going to include a list of honorable mentions. I'm going to include a list of movies that I still plan on seeing, and then I'll do my official top 10. And I'm hoping in the comments I'm going to get a lot of juicy suggestions for some movies that I've overlooked over the years. But first things first, let's define the erotic thriller if we can. Like, is there a difference between an erotic thriller versus a crime film or a gangster film that happens to have nudity? And for me, yes, there is. The difference can be a little hazy and a little subjective, but for me, the erotic thriller feels more like a psychological thriller. Usually you have an insanely sexy lead character who is killing folks, and another sexy character who's trying to stay alive or catch them. Movies like Fatal Attraction in the 1980s basically defined this subgenre, leading to hundreds if not thousands of imitators. And in the 90s, these movies just dominated late night cable, or if you checked into a cheap motel, you could watch them all on SpectraVision, or if you went into any sort of mom and pop video store or a Blockbuster video, you'd always have like the mystery suspense section where you'd have all these interchangeable movies that dealt with this topic, but it was just a wonderfully sleazy and very profitable marketplace. But some of the recurring tropes or story details in these stories include things like courtroom dramas or sexy psychoanalysts, serial killers, obviously, corrupt cops, lots and lots of hookers and strippers. Basically all the ingredients that a growing boy needs, but every once in a while with these movies, the photography or the writing or the acting or the direction would be so good, I feel like the movies would transcend their trashy constraints and become legit movie masterpieces. But not to worry, this video is not going to focus exclusively on the best of the best. I got a few sleazy classics thrown into the mix as well. But another thing to keep in mind is that during the 1990s, a lot of these erotic thrillers didn't even include nudity. I mean, a perfect example would be the movie Poison Ivy with Drew Barrymore. And there's no nudity in it, but it's still a very sultry, very entertaining, very enjoyable erotic thriller. But for me, to make the top 10 list, you do need to have legit nudity. This is a list for people who enjoy strong drink. But another restriction on this list is no horror movies. No people making out with vampires or demons or werewolves. This has got to be purely based in reality. And also, I'm not going to be including skin-tastic classics like Boogie Nights. Boogie Nights obviously is an amazing movie, but it's not remotely an erotic thriller. It's a totally different genre. Or a movie like Showgirls. I feel like Showgirls might have even benefited if it had included a few erotic thriller subplots. That might have helped it succeed in its initial theatrical run. But for me, Showgirls is not an erotic thriller at all. It's basically a rags to riches, like sleazy showbiz story. It has more in common with the musical than with the erotic thriller. And I'm also not going to be including disturbing crime films like Bad Lieutenant, which has, admittedly, some great nude scenes, including Harvey Keitel, full frontal nudity, kind of mumbling and muttering into the camera. But no one in their right minds is going to describe Bad Lieutenant as an erotic thriller. But let me start with my honorable mentions that will not be making the list, and these are movies that I've seen in their entirety, not just the highlights, but we have Presumed Innocent from 1990, where you have a really hot scene between Greta Scacchi and Harrison Ford. We got Poison Ivy from 1992, a movie which features delightful lines like, "Fuck you" with a limp dick. But anyway, if you're a Drew Barrymore fan, definitely hunt down Poison Ivy. Body of Evidence from 1992, Scott Madonna. Terrible movie, but required viewing due to the outrageous sex scenes. Jade from 1995, which has a screenplay by Joe Esterhaus and direction by William Friedkin, a movie which features the legendary beauty Angie Everhart. Romeo's Bleeding from 1993. It's a pretty vintage 1990s crime film with some horrendous voiceover narration. However, you've got Lena Olin just peeling the layers of Gary Oldman's brain back layer by layer like an onion. Her scenes absolutely make the movie worth seeing. Guilty as Sin from 1993, directed by Sidney Lumet. It's a pretty wild movie in spite of having no nudity, and I would argue that it's required viewing just to watch the final scene where Rebecca De Mornay uses her mighty Valkyrie legs to kill Don Johnson, sending them both flying over a railing. At any rate, it's an outrageously cool scene. But we also have Final Analysis from 1992, featuring the lovely Kim Basinger, need I say more. Sliver from 1993, terrible movie, but it has Sharon Stone coming off the success of Basic Instinct, absolutely worth a look. Forever Mine from 1999, yet another terrible movie, but Gretchen Mol is just a next-level goddess in it. Dream Lover from 1993. This is a fresh discovery, which I saw through the Criterion Channel. And if you're a fan of Twin Peaks, and if you're a fan of the star Mädchen Amick, Jesus Christ, this movie has one nude scene that will absolutely make your heart stop. And last but not least, we have Single White Female from 1992, which in a lot of ways I feel like kind of defines everything there is to know and love about the erotic thriller genre from this period. And now I need to acknowledge some of the erotic thrillers that I've never seen. However, with each and every single one of these movies, I've seen all the juicy bits on websites like MrSkin.com. But two of these I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that I've never seen because I fucking love Jennifer Connelly. I've been a lifelong fan. But I've never seen The Hot Spot from 1990, and I've never seen Mulholland Falls from 1996, both of which contain next-level nude scenes. But I've never seen Malice from 1993 with Nicole Kidman. Never seen The Comfort of Strangers, directed by Paul Schrader, starring Natasha Richardson. Never seen China Moon from 1994. Never seen Never Talk to Strangers from 1995, which seems to have some outrageous scenes between Antonio Banderas and Rebecca De Mornay. And as far as the Criterion Channel is concerned, there are a few left on the program that I still need to see, like Criminal Passion from 1994, as well as Flesh Tone from 1994 as well. But enough procrastination, enough bullshittery. It's time to get down to business with my number 10. And for this slot, I wanted to pick a movie that would represent all the late night sleazy cable classics, all the straight to video classics that you would find in mom and pop video stores behind the beaded curtains, movies that can kind of blur the lines between erotic thrillers or just being softcore porn. And you might make a case that these movies don't necessarily have the artistry of a movie by someone like David Cronenberg or Stanley Kubrick or Paul Verhoeven. But goddamn, like this was a big, giant, thriving marketplace where a lot of really sexy stars made quite a good living making one movie after another. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of contenders that could take this top slot. And some of the examples would be movies like Poison Ivy 3, The New Seduction with Jamie Presley, or Blown Away from 1992 with Nicole Eggert and the Two Coreys, Indecent Behavior from 1993 with the lovely Shannon Tweed, or Animal Instincts from 1992 starring Shannon Moore. I mean, all these actresses are legends in their own time. But the movie I'm going with for this slot is Undercover, a.k.a. Undercover Heat from 1995, starring Athena Massey as well as Rena Raphael. But this movie follows a tough-talking, butt-kicking cop who goes undercover as a high-priced call girl working in a brothel in order to bust a serial killer who's been preying upon working girls. And Athena is one of those actresses where she's got one of those bodies that we started seeing a lot more of in the 1990s. Very well toned, very muscular. I've always been a fan of very athletic physiques. But the movie has next level nude scenes, next level sex scenes, as well as a very young Jeffrey Dean Morgan, as well as Meg Foster in the cast. And it can be a little tough to find. Sometimes it's available on Amazon, but it's always available on sites like X-Hamster. So if you have a taste for the movies that are on the sleazier end of the spectrum in this genre, I strongly recommend that you hunt down Undercover Heat at your first available opportunity. But for number 9, we got a movie that's a little bit more respectable in terms of the star power, but just as deranged, just as crazy, just as much of like a kind of creative misfire in some ways, but Color of Night from 1994. This movie came out when I was 18, and yet I somehow totally managed to miss it at the time. I absolutely have no excuses, but I don't remember a single person talking about it, and it was a notorious flop in its day. But I didn't discover it until many years later, thanks to my friend Bill Scurry, when we tackled it for Wrong Reel 550 on one of our Naughty 90s Nostalgia episodes. But this is one of those movies that had a bunch of behind-the-scenes battles over the final cut. But you've got Bruce Willis at the peak of his fame and stardom. This is the same year where he appeared in Pulp Fiction. But the reason people talk about this movie is because of Jane March and Leslie Ann Warren and all these ridiculous psychoanalysis scenes where you have these bonkers group therapy scenes with the kind of fake pseudo-psychoanalysis that Hollywood can be pretty famous for. But the reason this movie is making the list is that it's got some of the most outrageous sex scenes of the 1990s, along with some of the most ridiculous kind of wailing saxophone music. It's sex music, but there's this one sex scene with Bruce Willis and Jane March where it will go and go and go for like 30 minutes, and then it'll kind of fade out and have a little conversation, and then suddenly the music will rear back up and then it's back on again. I mean, it is so over the top. But for anybody out there who's ever been dying to get a peek at Bruce Willis's dingus, this movie will absolutely deliver on that front. So if you like spectacular disasters where everything creatively seems to be going in different directions and the final product is a total mess, but it's irresistible and compelling all the same, check out Color of Night. But now for my number 8, we have an instant cult classic with Wild Things. This is one of those cultural hand grenades that took the world by storm. I was a junior in college when it came out, so suffice to say I was the perfect target audience. And yeah, this movie, it achieved instant Hall of Fame status and turned Denise Richards into the it girl of the late 90s. Like a year later, or 2 years later, she'd be appearing in the James Bond film, The World Is Not Enough. But this movie is just wildly entertaining from start to finish. It's got more double crosses than I care to mention, but 25 years later, it still holds up pretty well. It's got style to spare. It's got arguably the best threesome caught on film in the entire decade of the 1990s, with Matt Dillon as a high school guidance counselor getting it on with his 2 favorite students, played by Neve Campbell and Denise Richards, whose underwear, by the way, I should mention, ends up in Matt Dillon's pocket. It's absolutely scandalous and well worth hunting down. But from a number 7, I'm going with the movie for all the people out there whose taste in erotic thrillers might be a little less heterosexual than mine, because we have Bound from 1996, starring Gina Gershon and Jennifer Tilly. And this is the feature film debut by the Wachowskis, a full 3 years before they released The Matrix. And it's incredible watching it now because you can see so much about their style and their personal aesthetic already on display in this movie. Like, it almost feels like it could be a little like subplot or a little chapter set within the world of The Matrix where the characters have not yet taken the red pill. And this is one of those 90s erotic thrillers that feels like it has so much in common with the great classic film noir of the late 40s and early 50s. Like the Gina Gershon part, if this movie had come out 50 years earlier, it would have been played by John Garfield or Robert Mitchum or Burt Lancaster or Robert Ryan. But Gina Gershon, she absolutely pulls it off. She's basically a thief who's really good with her hands. She's really good with cars. She's really good with plumbing. She's just an all-around kind of tough chick. and she falls for this outrageously sexy prostitute played by Jennifer Tilly, and Jennifer Tilly is working on this plan where they're going to try and steal a few $1,000,000 from Joe Pantoliano, aka Joey Pants, as well as his organized crime associates. It's just really steamy stuff, 100% worth watching, wildly entertaining. And all these years later, I still feel like it's one of the best movies that the Wachowskis have made. But number 6, it's time to get into the work of Stanley Kubrick with Eyes Wide Shut from 1999. It's got Cruise, it's got Kidman, it's got Kubrick. This is one of the most hotly debated films of the 1990s. And in spite of being a film by one of my all-time favorite filmmakers, the reason it's not ranked more highly on this list is that I feel like it's got some shortcomings as an erotic thriller, even if it succeeds in other areas like jealousy, obsession, sexual insecurity. Because the irony is that this movie has this giant notorious orgy scene. It's actually not much of a turn on at all. And I feel like to be an erotic thriller, it has to be erotic. It has to be a turn on. And to be honest, I get much more turned on by the very, very brief fantasies that take place in Tom Cruise's head as he's imagining his wife getting it on with another man. But if you're looking for evidence for just how much the culture has changed from the late 90s to the present day, the idea of the greatest filmmakers and the biggest stars in the world getting together to do like a 2.5-hour erotic thriller would be absolutely unheard of for a studio like Warner Brothers. But back in the late 90s, I mean, it was a little controversial and it was hotly debated, but no one ever questioned it as good business sense. And yeah, I feel like a little late 90s goes a long way, and I'm hoping that we'll see a return of this genre at some point down the road. But let's get into the top 5. And starting with my number 5, we have The Last Seduction from 1994. I feel like this is one of those rare 90s erotic thrillers where I find it just as cool and compelling and kind of tough talking as a lot of the classic film noirs from the late 40s and early 50s. Because if you were to take Lauren Bacall out of To Have and Have Not or The Big Sleep and then drop her into 1994, you would have Linda Fiorentino delivering what I think is the performance of a fucking lifetime. And this movie might be a little light on nudity, but it is heavy on sexual tension and has some of the best goddamn dialogue that I've ever heard from any decade. Case in point being,
I'm hung like a horse. Think about it.
Let's see.
Excuse me?
Mr. Ed, let's see.
but there's something about a woman with a deep, slow, confident voice outwitting and outmaneuvering all these sleazy characters that I just find irresistible. This movie is sexy as hell, but it's about as sharp as a knife right into your rib cage. So go watch it. You can thank me later. But now for my number 4, we might have to bend and contort the strict definition of the erotic thriller a bit, but I had to include this movie. We have David Cronenberg's Crash from 1996. And the reason I say we have to bend and contort the definition of the erotic thriller a bit, I feel like an erotic thriller is basically like a movie adaptation of like a trashy novel you would see on like a rack in a grocery store with like Fabio on the cover and like a girl like holding a gun to his head. Like, it's a pretty trashy genre. But this movie is based on a great literary masterpiece, and it's a movie that I feel like absolutely transcends and leaves behind the trappings of the erotic thriller genre. But it's got so much in common in terms of like the stylish photography and the overall mood and atmosphere and like the ever-present feeling of danger. But this is one of those movies that dives right into the intersection of human sexuality and technology, more specifically, the ways that the destructive power of car crashes can transform and or arouse like these specific individuals who are drawn to each other in increasingly dangerous encounters. And I think it's got one of the ballsiest ensemble casts that was assembled for any movie throughout the entire decade of the 1990s. And the cast was just absolutely fearless, willing to ride right over the cliff alongside David Cronenberg. And when I think back fondly to the golden age of controversial, kind of transgressive art house movies of the 1990s that can potentially shock the world, Crash is always there, ready to traumatize and stimulate me all over again. But number 3, Lost Highway. So I feel like if you were to look at all the filmmakers over the last 50 years, I think David Lynch has done a better job of kind of taking the mood and style and feeling of film noir and kind of updating it into unexplored terrain. Like, he's done a better job of that than any other director alive. And I caught this sucker in the theater. I was totally enthralled. And I was still in college at the time, and a day or so later I went to one of my film classes, and I may or may not have been under the influence of some mind-altering substances. I was planning on saying nothing all class, just sitting in the corner, getting credit for attending, and then just going home and maybe taking a nap or whatever. But as I walked in, all my classmates were kind of angrily debating Lost Highway. And once again, I was trying just to say nothing because I was feeling a little kind of shy and paranoid. Suddenly, this one girl just whirled on me and pointed at me and said, "And I bet you liked it." And I was like, "Oh." And the teacher of the class walked in right as I was trying to kind of fumble my way through a response. And he's like, "Oh, so James, like, what did you like about the film? Because I thought the first quarter was borderline brilliant, but the rest was unwatchable." And I was like, "Oh." At any rate, one of my most verbally inarticulate defenses of a movie in my entire life was made on that day, trying to defend Lost Highway against an angry classroom. But I feel like if you're looking for a challenging erotic thriller that will place demands on your imagination or your sense of story structure, or what is the actual kind of internal logic of a movie and at what point can you bend it or break it, put this movie at the top of your list. But at a bare minimum, even if you don't like the movie or you find it frustrating, Patricia Arquette delivers some of the all-time great nude scenes from any era, and so thank you, David Lynch, for giving me one of the best erotic thrillers that I've ever seen. And now for my number 2, let's get into one of the big heavy hitters, because we have Bitter Moon, directed by the notorious director Roman Polanski. And I feel like when people talk about Polanski, they always mention Rosemary's Baby, dynamite horror movie, or they mention Chinatown, one of the great film noirs. But I'm going to say something that might be controversial. I rank Bitter Moon right alongside the best films by Polanski, whether you're talking about Repulsion or The Fearless Vampire Killers or Macbeth or The Tenant. He's been in a lot of good movies, but I think Bitter Moon might be his last masterpiece, in my opinion. This might be the most cynical movie that I've ever seen about love and human relationships, and just the absolutely astonishing acts of cruelty and revenge a couple's capable of once they've achieved total sexual bankruptcy. And I don't want to get too sidetracked with the intricacies of the plot, but you basically have a couple played by Hugh Grant and Kristen Scott Thomas that's on a cruise to India, and en route they encounter this couple where one individual who's crippled and in a wheelchair wants to tell Hugh Grant his life story and how he ended up in such a sorry, pitiful state. But this is one of those movies that's incredibly rewarding upon multiple reviewings, and it gets my highest possible recommendation. But from a number 1, the choice is obvious: Basic Instinct. This is the gold standard by which all other erotic thrillers must be judged. I think it will always remain the heavyweight champion, the GOAT, the greatest of all time. I mean, what can you say about Basic Instinct that has not already been said many times by me on this channel, like in my top 10 Paul Verhoeven video, which I'll include a link to down in the video description below. But when a movie takes off like this, it makes sense why we saw hundreds, if not thousands, of imitators just flourishing and thriving throughout the decade of the 1990s, because this movie was made on a budget of $49 million and it generated $352 million in box office, not to mention all the countless collector's editions and Blu-rays and re-releases in every format imaginable over the last 30 years. But Sharon Stone and Michael Douglas just showed balls of steel making this movie with Paul Verhoeven, and Verhoeven used a really interesting tactic for planning out all the sex scenes. And I feel like it's an approach that would be very advantageous to a lot of other filmmakers. But he used elaborate storyboards and planned every single nude scene like you were planning like a really elaborate action scene. I feel like that's the best way, because then the actors can see that is the shot, that is the angle by which you'll be seeing my uncovered body. And that way everybody knows exactly what's going to go down. Everybody knows exactly what's involved. And in one of his interviews, Paul Verhoeven described how he finds that to be much more useful than just turning on the cameras and just telling his actors, make it hot, because everybody's got a different idea of what hot even is. In any case, this is a one-of-a-kind movie that is still wildly entertaining all these decades later. And if you've never seen Basic Instinct, what are you doing? Stop this video and go fucking watch Basic Instinct. But I hope y'all enjoyed this video. Thank you for sticking with me on this kind of strange, pervy journey. It's funny, there are a lot of people out there these days who are pushing hard for no sex in cinema. I'm just like, why? Like, cinema is an art form, and art form should be able to tackle every aspect of the human experience. And if you're going to try to deprive cinema of sex, at that point you're basically saying it's no longer an art form, because books and paintings and music and every form of human expression should be able to explore every aspect of the human experience. And without sex, none of us would be here. So once again, this aversion to sex in cinema, I just completely, totally disagree. If people don't want to watch sex in cinema, that's totally up to them. But don't try to force your own values onto other people. Don't try to make the rest of society conform to your own narrow definition of art and storytelling. I love sex in cinema. I love sex and violence and horror and thrillers all stirred together. For me, it is absolutely compelling and irresistible. So I hope y'all will find this list to be rewarding or useful as you take your own journey through the history of the 90s erotic thriller, a great golden age for the genre. But at this point, I'm officially rambling. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit that notification bell to be notified for future videos. I'm starting to get tongue-tied. I've been talking for too long. Hunt me down on Twitter at GeekingOut if you want to talk more. But thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.